It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Valerie Jones-Taylor to campus. Dr. Taylor is an assistant professor at Spelman College. She received her doctorate in social psychology from Stanford University in 2009, where she was advised and mentored by Claude Steele. She was a National Science Foundation postdoctoral fellow at Princeton University under the guidance of Dr. Nicole Shelton, and she began her tenure as assistant professor of psychology at Spelman College in the fall of 2011. She received a Ford postdoctoral fellowship in 2011 to continue her research on stereotype threat. Dr. Taylor's research provides strong evidence that psychological factors can impact differences in academic achievement and broadly explores how and when identity threat, racial or gender stereotyping may be advantageous or detrimental to a person's cognitive and behavioral outcomes. Dr. Taylor will share her insights with us from her research, including some yet unpublished results. Welcome.
So thank you all for inviting me here today. I am excited to not only share some work that my colleague and I published in the past, but also some new and exciting research, guys. So I will begin by just discussing how pernicious stereotype threat can actually be. And I'll go and give a little background on stereotype threat just to make sure that everyone understands the phenomenon, or as we understand it today, in the literature. And particularly, I was interested not only in how it affected academic performance, but also how it had the power to affect learning and how people may acquire or fail to acquire new skills in a threatening environment. And then secondly, using a statistical technique called meta-analysis, we synthesize stereotype threat studies across a large body of work to determine the magnitude of the effect across the literature. And the meta-analysis is our most recent work that we're really excited about because it looks at it from a variety of perspectives. We look at a number of stereotype groups as well and estimate how practically important stereotype threat effects have been in the literature. So as many of us are aware, there remain persistent gaps in achievement among a number of different indices, from test scores to GPA, for example. And here's one prominent example of that, and these are the white-black achievement gap in reading that we see. And this sort of mirrors some of the scores that we see across the literature in a variety of domains. So this in particular is a table that shows from K through 12 education the differences in the reading scores there. So there have been a number of factors that people have put forth to say why these gaps may occur. Some of them have been that there are just cultural differences that may account for these things. There may be issues of socioeconomic disadvantage, for example. Perhaps it's the internalization of negative stereotypes, or maybe there are biological differences. So those are some of the ideas that people have put forth to explain these differences. But stereotype threat researchers sought to understand this outcome from a different perspective, and they began focusing on a slightly different issue, which may be very important to this audience in particular as well. Because they were focused on the differences that were found among highly motivated students. So why were we seeing these performance gaps among students that care so much about their education and that were expected to perform so well? So for example, they were wondering why students that were performing very well in high school or had really good SAT scores, why during their matriculation into college, their scores didn't seem to match what we expected them to, how we expected them to perform. And so the original stereotype threat researchers were really interested in understanding this phenomenon. So that's where it started. So the work started now nearly 20 years ago with Dr. Claude Steele and his then postdoc, Josh Aronson. And they wanted to systematically address this issue from what they call the psychosocial perspective. And the term they came up with was stereotype threat. which is a disruptive worry or apprehension about the possibility that one might inadvertently confirm a negative group stereotype. So I'll try to break it down a little bit and give a few examples to make it a little clearer for everyone. Okay. So remember, the initial aim of stereotype threat research was to examine the factors suppressing the intellectual performance of originally African American students at some of these elite institutions, and also women in math, science, and engineering as well, because we would see a lot of these similar achievement gaps among women in the hard sciences. So what was of interest is why these SAT scores they had weren't predicting their performance in college. So the research started by trying to understand whether these stereotypes themselves would actually suppress the performance of these groups and what was going on in this particular process. The theory goes further to suggest that there may be situational cues in a performance setting that may cause underperformance. And these are cues that are produced and sustained through one's environment, such as the way a setting could be organized, the features of the environment, the messages that are conveyed in an environment. All of those are considered situational cues that could potentially cause stereotype threat. Some of the things that have been looked at, for example, are the evaluative nature of tests in an environment, simply mentioning group differences, or knowing about group differences in a particular environment, or being in a setting where you may be numerically underrepresented on a certain feature of your identity may be numerically underrepresented in a particular setting. So here's one of the seminal stereotype threat studies. So it was conducted with African American and white students. And with African American, they found that African American students, compared to white students, tended to underperform on an exam when it was described as diagnostic or evaluative of their academic ability. Okay? But interestingly, when the task was described as non-diagnostic, or in this particular task, non-evaluative of their ability, we saw that this achievement gap would disappear. And this has been replicated literally hundreds of times. I have 316 studies so far that show that this sort of replication. And the important thing to note from this is that they're not just with African American students, they're not just with women in math and science, it actually runs the gamut. And so I like to give a few examples to help people understand what stereotype threat may feel like in the moment. They've done a lot of research on trying to understand the processes or the mechanisms that are related to it, and much of it has to do with a feeling of arousal, anxiety, frustration that people may feel when they're facing a particular challenge or a demanding situation, okay? And it's often related to one's awareness that they could be judged or treated in terms of these negative group stereotypes. So my advisor used to give the example all the time of going into a Silicon Valley startup, okay? He's a middle-aged guy, and he would say, he would walk in and notice all the 20-somethings would have small little cubicles, and they'd have all the bicycles hanging from the top of each cubicle. So he'd go in to give a talk or do business, and he would suddenly feel, well, am I welcomed here? Is my intelligence considered, or is my age considered a liability here, for example? How will people feel about me? Do they see me as this wise sage? Or will they see me as this older guy with these weird ideas? So in that way, he would sometimes feel, would he be inadvertently, or some of his comments be inadvertently read through the lens of stereotypes of people who are older? And a number of people may experience that sort of thing. Similarly, there's been a lot of research on interracial interactions as well related to stereotype threat. And some people, white people, may say that if they're in an interracial interaction, they could feel that sometimes some of the comments that they make, some of the perspectives that they have, could be read through the lens of being seen as racist or as prejudiced. So that feeling, that level of discomfort that you feel, the anxiety that you may feel in those sorts of situations are what we would term stereotype threat. So that's kind of the feeling, the emotional component that you have. And you can imagine if you're in an experience, a performance experience, and you're feeling this sort of anxiety, your performance may decrease. If you're interacting in an interracial interaction and you begin to feel this way, you can imagine how your interaction with this student or this other person could be a little uncomfortable. And that's sort of the experience of stereotype threat. Okay? So I wanted to sort of give you that background as I jump into the details of my talk. And from this literature, we have a sense that stereotype threat can severely impact intellectual or academic performance. That's really what the literature has focused on most often. But then we begin to wonder whether this pernicious effects would also affect learning. And so that's what I'll start with today. And if it does affect something as broad and as serious as learning, how then do we remove it? How do we change this environment? So the meta-analysis results that I'll share with you today begin to quantify over a large body of work the size of the stereotype threat effect. And then particularly we were interested in those factors or the different strategies that researchers have used to reduce the stereotype threat effect. And we think that's important for education and public policy more generally. So I'm open to questions, so you can stop me if you have any along the way. Right. So I'd like to start by doing a little thought experiment as we talk about what we've termed the learning threat hypothesis. So imagine an African-American student in a large lecture hall on the first day of class in an intellectually demanding course. This could be at a predominantly white college or university. And looking around, the student may notice that most of her classmates are white, that the professor is white, and maybe many of the students in there may be as well. Okay? So in this particular environment, the student may become keenly aware that there are racial group stereotypes that exist in this particular setting. And the racial group stereotype related to the student may be that of academic unintelligence. So when the professor lectures, she may worry that any confusion that she expresses, or if she asks any question, it could confirm these negative stereotypes about her. And so we wondered if this then would affect how well a student would not only acquire that information in a learning setting of this manner, but also how they would perform on future tests of that material as well. Okay? And this is despite a person's high intellectual potential in the first place. The other thing is that if a student takes a follow-up course and they've experienced stereotype threat in a previous course, it could cumulatively affect their performance over time. So that's something we're really interested in thinking about as well. Okay. So as this highlights, we hypothesize that stereotype threat in a learning environment will undermine stereotype students' ability to learn new information, and it may perhaps cause them to underperform on future tests of that material, even in settings that may be considered safe or psychologically safe settings in the future. So there's a bit of background. We know that stereotype threat can undermine performance, but why do we think it'll impact learning? And so it's important to remember that learning is probably one of the most important aspects of a person's educational experience, and the knowledge that we learn is often closely related to performance. So there's been a lot of classic work in cognitive psychology that look at the basic processes in the learning environment, such as learning and memory, for example, and they distinguish between recall and recognition, memory processes, and things like that. And more recently, research has focused on how the learning environment actually affects students' perceptions and their approach to learning in particular. So while this has been important, there had been no research to date that actually captured how maybe a person's background, their racial agenda background, could be affected in a learning environment. So why would stereotype threat affect learning? Because we know that many things outside of stereotypes have the possibility of affecting the learning process, such as arousal, negative emotion regulation, things could be cognitively demanding, things like that. And that could definitely affect learning, and that has nothing to do with stereotypes. Right? But we do know from research on stereotype threat, that a lot of these same cognitive processes occur when people experience stereotype threat. So they, as I was describing examples before, they could feel this increased arousal, these negative emotion regulation processes and things like that. So we wanted to know if we could apply some of these same processes to the experience of stereotype threat in the learning environment as well. And there was a little bit of evidence to suggest that this may be the case. And so in one previous study, they found that when both men and women learned in an academic environment as a gender solo, and that's by oneself, so one woman to 3 men or 3 men to 1 woman, for example, these gender solos, they subsequently will recall less information in a later session, okay? Even when the session was thought to be non-threatening in nature. Okay? So there's been research like that. And also another lab found that when women were in a stereotype threat condition, so when they were reminded that there may be gender differences on a task, they needed more time to distinguish Chinese characters from non-target characters. And this was taken as evidence that it could affect how women learn in these threatening environments compared to when they were in a non-threatening environment. They were able to recognize these Chinese characters more quickly. So putting all this together, we asked, well, first, what is the difference between stereotype threat in the performance and learning environment, and why might it be important? So we know that academic performance measures success, or how well students meet standards that are put out for them at an institution, and this is usually measured with these age-old standardized testing measures. Okay? But learning, on the other hand, which is of course related, is acquiring new information or modifying existing knowledge and behaviors and skills, and it may involve synthesizing new pieces of information. So in order to perform well, we must learn well, right? So we all pretty much have a sense of that. And if we don't learn well in one setting, it could break down the building blocks of what we need in future settings. So given this literature, we proposed that stereotype threat in a learning environment will undermine stereotype students' ability to learn new information, which could potentially cause them to underperform on future tests of the material, even in psychologically non-threatening performance settings, and ultimately it could lead to cumulative performance deficits. So in this first study, we sort of wanted to document whether this would actually be the case and see if there were ways to reduce these effects as well. So now I'll describe one of the studies from this line of work for you. So the study is a little bit complicated, so I'm first going to do an overview, then I'll go into the more specifics of the study. So the study occurred in 2 sessions, 1 week apart. And in this session, we invited African American and white students to come in and learn the definitions of 24 rare words under threatening conditions, or under non-threatening conditions. Okay? And in the session, and this was the first session, and in the second session, they were asked to recall the definitions of those words, either under threat or under no threat. And here are some of the examples of the words. They kind of remind you of GRE words, for example. So we worked really hard to make sure, we did a lot of pre-testing to make sure that 5% or less students actually knew what these words meant in the first place. So they would have to study the words in this first session. So when they came back in the second session, we measured their recall for the definitions of these words, and they were simply prompted by the word to provide its definition, and they had to supply it from memory. And this refers to the retrieval aspect of learning. And we also had them do a performance task which related to the recognition part of learning. So they had to match the word to its definition. And we thought that, of course, this task would be a little easier than the recall task. Right? So here for the details, I like to tell the details so people understand what a threatening learning environment looks like. compared to a non-threatening learning and performance environment. So participants were randomly assigned to either the learning threat condition or the learning no threat condition, and it was a between subjects factor. And in this learning threat condition, they had to do the word learning task, and it was represented as to be relevant to negative intellectual stereotypes about African Americans. So the students were told that we would be investigating how well people from different backgrounds learn, and that the task was assessing the students' learning abilities and limitations. And so I'll talk about in the second part of the talk how I don't even need to be that heavy-handed, right, for people to experience stereotype threat. But this is how we manipulated it in this first study. So half the students got these instructions, and the other half of the students were in the learning no threat condition. And in this condition, the word learning task was portrayed so that it would be irrelevant to negative intellectual stereotypes and to create this psychologically safe learning environment. Thus, students were told that the study was not evaluative of their learning abilities. Then they were all given 10 minutes to study the definitions of these 24 rare words, and approximately 1 week later, they came back for study 2, and we had them in the same laboratory. So we wanted to make sure that we didn't change the room or anything, because there's been a lot of work that suggests when you change where people learn and perform, that can also have an effect on performance as well.
Can I ask a question? Mm-hmm. So interested in how you learn and how your personal learning style, that's non-threatening? That's perceived as non-threatening?
Yes, it is, because it's not saying that we're worried about you in particular or how anyone from your background or group learn. So those sort of instructions have been found to be disarming in a sense. So in session 2, they come back, and we had 2 conditions there, but everybody participated in these 2 conditions. One was a warm-up, and it was simply said that we wanted them to familiarize themselves with the task. So 12 of the words were just randomly selected, and they had to recall those words. They had 7 minutes to free recall the definitions, and then following that, 7 minutes to match the word to its definition. And this is what people usually find interesting about the second condition, which was the threatening condition. We said, okay, now you've done the warm-up, you're about to take the test. Okay. So we've carefully selected some of the words from the list, and you'll again do the task that you had practiced with earlier. And please provide, and this test will provide a genuine test of your verbal abilities and limitations. Okay? So in this sense, it was described as diagnostic of one's learning abilities. Okay? Again, they had 7 minutes to free recall and 7 minutes to match the remaining 12 words. So now I'll show you the results. And just to orient everyone with the graph, the y-axis is the percent of words recalled here, recalled correctly. And the x-axis is the race of the participants in the study. So I'll start with presenting the findings first for white students. And what we found there is their performance did not differ when they were completing the warm-up. Okay? So when they learned in the threatening or the non-threatening learning environment, we didn't see a significant difference between those groups. However, we did see a difference with the African American students. So what we found is that when Black students learned in the threatening learning environment, they performed nearly 50% worse than those students that had learned in the non-threatening performance environment. So thus it seems as if they didn't learn as well in the threatening environment or something to that effect, because they just weren't performing as well there. Now for the test, okay, remember we just called it getting ready to do a test now. We carefully selected these other group of words. And so we see the same pattern of results for white students. There was not a significant difference there. But you can see that performance seems to be depressed sort of overall because it was a test. It was now evaluative. Okay? Again, we see the same pattern of results for African American students when this task was described to be evaluative of one's intellectual abilities. Yes.
Are there significant differences between the black students and the white students if you compare across racial groups? So if looking in the warm-up, if just eyeballing it, it looks like the black students in the learning threat conditions performed on the warm-up.
Oh,
performed
yes.
As well as the white students in the learning threat, and maybe even in the learning no threat and learning threat.
Yes, so that's a good point that you made. There was one of our colleagues did a paper on the latent ability hypothesis. And so what they were trying to suggest is that when you effectively take threat out of a situation, you will see performance across groups be basically equivalent. And sometimes you may even see stereotype students' performance be greater because they've been performing consistently or constantly in domains where their performance was constantly depressed. So you may see this effect where you'd be surprised at how their performance would rebound when you can consistently create non-evaluative environments or environments that feel more psychologically safe. Okay? So a lot of people sort of have issue with this non-evaluative environment thing. We're in college. How can we have a non-evaluative environment? So what I'll talk about momentarily are strategies that people have used despite an environment being evaluative, because that's the lay of the land. You can't really get out of that, of course, okay? Nor do we necessarily want to. So thank you, that's a good point. So that was for the recall task, again, that was the harder task. So what we thought was the easier task was the matching, and it was the recognition. And basically, what I want to show you here is we see the same pattern of results. This actually begins to be a significant difference for the white students, where they're actually performing somewhat better in the learning threat condition compared to the no threat condition. And there's a literature called stereotype lift, actually. And it's related to how people that are in non-stereotyped groups may actually get a little boost when they are in a setting where comparatively they may have the advantage in certain situations. So I can talk, if anyone has questions about that, I can talk a little bit more about that later. But we also see the same pattern of results where students, African American students, are performing better after learning in the no threat condition compared to the threatening condition. And we see the same pattern of results on the test as well. Okay. This set is marginal, but it's the same pattern of results. So on the recall test and on the recall task, and to a lesser extent on the matching task, we found direct evidence that stereotype threat can undermine learning and can potentially cause African American students to underperform on future tests of that material, even in what we would call psychologically safe or non-threatening performance settings. So these results illustrate a large cumulative impact of stereotype threat and what the problems that it can cause when it pervades both the learning and the performance environments. Okay. So here are two important cells that we like to look at, because the black students' recall performance actually dropped 60% from when they both learned and performed in non-threatening environments compared to those that had both learned and performed in threatening learning environments. Okay? So further, when they experienced this, when they had learned and performed in both of those, we can see that the performance suffered in either conditions after they learned in the learning threatening environment doing the warm-up, and after they had learned in the threatening environment completing the warm-up, and learning in the threatening environment completing the test. It was as if in both sessions they hadn't fully acquired that new information. Yes?
Do these effects get modified by whether the experimenter and the participant match in terms of sex and race and seeming background?
Yes, they do. They do sometimes. And that is one of the important things that some of the research has shown that helps to reduce stereotype threat. In this case, we kept that consistent. So we matched the experimenter's gender with the participant's gender, and all experimenters in this case were white. Okay, just to keep it consistent in this particular study. But that is a good point, and I'll talk about the impact of what the literature has called role models in a moment.
Are white male students that are high achieving ever in an environment where they feel stereotype threat and their performance is depressed? And if so, what do those conditions, or what is the comparative group for that?
Yes, so one study there have been a few studies on that. One study was, they conducted it, I think at the University of Texas at Austin, and it was when white men in particular thought that their performance would be compared or evaluated against Asian men. Okay? And that was a very threatening situation. So you see the exact same pattern of results here as well. It runs the gamut though. So Asian women and men are not out of the ballpark either. So there's this really nice stereotype. It's one of my favorite stereotype threat studies because it highlights how identity is really important in pushing these effects. So it was conducted with Asian American and Asian Canadian women, and what they found was that when women were first asked to do a generic, one of those demographic sort of surveys or questions before the test, and they indicated their gender, they underperformed. However, when they indicated their ethnic background, their performance improved, and there was a significant difference. So what you can see is the particular identity that you highlight, or the ones that seem relevant or are salient in a setting, can actually push around that performance. Now that's actually amazing to me, that it can take so little to push something that we call hardwired and concrete around so easily. So I think it's really important, and I'm not saying that IQ and those things aren't real, but I do believe that it's important to think about the fluidity of some of these constructs. So thank you. Right? So in this case, we suggest that students could perhaps experience what we call double jeopardy. And that's when they experience stereotype threat in either the learning or the performance environment, because we saw these cumulative performance decrements on the recall task, and to a lesser extent on the matching task. And so to sort of conclude this area of work, overall it highlights the importance of creating these psychologically safe learning environments. And so that's where I want to pick up now. Like, how do we create these safe learning environments to not end on this sour note of, this academic underperformance is something we just can't get out of. There are many ways that we can get out of it, right? So I will switch over to talking about that now. So what I'm going to share with you now is a newer line of work from results on a stereotype threat meta-analysis, which will quantify the magnitude of stereotype threat effects across diverse groups. And in particular, it focuses on the importance of employing strategies designed to reduce stereotype threat. Okay? And I really like, I did, so I really like the meta-analysis. But one of the things that I think, the one point that I think is brought forth through the meta-analysis is that because we have such a large body of studies, it speaks to the broad issue of stereotype threat. I like to make clear as I talk to audiences that this is not an issue simply about minority students and women in math and science. It can affect all of us, and some of the examples I provided earlier hopefully help you understand how it can cross many lines of ethnicity, race. There's some studies in there that look at sexual orientation, various things like that. So it's a very broad array of studies that we're looking at. Okay. So there have been a few past quantitative reviews that have looked at stereotype threat. And one shows that subtle versus moderate or explicit threat activating cues. So some of those, some explicit things could be saying there are group differences expected here or something. That's an explicit form of activating stereotype threat. So they looked at some of these things and how cues that were categorized as subtle or explicit threat removal cues, how they could differentially moderate performance of minorities and women in experiencing stereotype threat. So it kind of was a more focused meta-analysis in the beginning. There's been, what I mentioned earlier, was a meta-analysis on the latent ability hypothesis, which demonstrated that grades and test scores often underestimate the true ability of stereotyped students because of the existence of stereotype threat in each and every academic setting where their ability has been assessed. And one looks specifically at the differences between African Americans and Hispanics, and they really didn't find any differences among these different groups and the various cues that may cause stereotype threat. So we sought to broaden this perspective and look at specifically how threat removal cues could eliminate stereotype threat and the value of that. And there's also been a number of qualitative reviews. So what we were interested in were the triggers, the remedies that people have looked at, and we want to quantify that in particular. So I start by first assessing the overall stereotype threat effect size across numerous groups, and it underscores just how important stereotype threat is in laboratory settings, which has yet to be done. We investigate the impact of specific threat-inducing cues that might undermine performance, and our working hypothesis was that in the stereotype threat literature, they say that it's a threat that's in the air, okay? And you may have read something like that before. It's like kind of all around us. It's sort of what we breathe. So if that's the case, it should be relatively easy to trigger a stereotype threat, okay? Importantly, we examined the impact of the many threat-reducing strategies that have been used to improve academic performance among diverse groups, and we focused on how threat-reducing strategies are necessary to remove stereotype threat. You can't just do nothing. You have to actively do something. And then I'll end with a few implications. So meta-analysis is the process of synthesizing data from a series of previously conducted studies to find patterns across a very large body of work. And so prior to our analyses, we performed a comprehensive literature search through listserv calls, looking at various academic journals, manuscripts, dissertations, etc. So a lot of published and unpublished data. We calculated Hedges G, which is a non-biased estimate of an effect size for each study, and it measures the standardized mean difference between two conditions, okay? And then we computed a summary effect size. So this is just a little statistical background for those who are interested in that. And what we're attempting to do are make within-group comparisons. So we want to compare, say, African-American students or female students or men in a particular, a lot of studies they've done with men have been men in the affective, emotional domain. When they bring that up, it can be seen as threatening, as if they don't have that same emotional sense as, say, women do, for example. So we compare those groups in what we call a threat condition compared to a no threat condition, okay? So if people perform the same in a threat condition versus a no threat condition, then there will be no difference. Okay? And maybe the study would be non-significant, for example. Okay? However, if they're underperforming in the threat condition compared to the non-threat condition, I present them as negative effect sizes for ease of interpretation. And then when we split to look at threat removal strategies, things that people have used to reduce stereotype threat in the environment, I will then use positive effect sizes, again, just for ease of interpretation as we talk about these ideas together. And per the conventions,
I have a quick question. So I'm interested in the group, one group you haven't, that you haven't talked about. Those are people who experience stereotype threat, yet they are quite successful, they perform well, right? So I would have been one of those students. I love when white people underestimate me. You know, it really helps. So what about that group, and how have you interpreted, or how do you theorize around that?
You know, I kind of wrote my dissertation on that. Called The Pressure to Work Harder.
Yeah.
Literally was part of the title.
I'm more productive than I would be.
I haven't integrated that work into this particular data set right now, So I'll hold that question to the end, yeah, and we can kind of talk about that a little bit later. Because it's a slightly different issue there. Okay? But yes, I actually do get that question quite a lot. How do people kind of push past some of these negative stereotypes?
And at what cost, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I'll hold on for a second. Yes.
This also sort of goes along with this question. Have you found that the stereotype that a learning threat is time sensitive? So for example, if a student has been in that threatening environment from freshman year to sophomore year to senior year, does that like have less of an effect over time if they've constantly been in that environment?
And that's
Yeah.
my student, by the way. Very good.
So cumulatively, unfortunately, the literature would suggest the average or the mean is that these are the effects. But everything is a normal distribution usually, right? So we have people in the outliers on either side. So we would find that yes, there are many people that may perform very well. However, where we're seeing the bulk of the issue and what we're really focusing on here is that middle group. So that's sort of how it tends to fall out in the literature.
You may have already addressed this, but it's kind of going along with what they're saying. Do you ever find that maybe stereotype threat has kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy for, say, white males in the studies, where like maybe they think that like they're supposed to do better on the test than other students, and thus they like do better in the threatening environment?
That was the stereotype live finding that I showed in one of the previous graphs. Yeah, no problem, but that's another question we often get. Yes, and we see that another really clear example of what you're talking about is a study that they ran with African American and white males in sports. So when a task was described as innate, a task that was of innate intellectual golfing experience or something like that, white men putted more balls into the holes. Black athletes did not. Then another group of students, they brought them in, black and white, males again, and they said, this is a task of your innate golfing ability. Now, what's the stereotype of African American men? That they have this natural, innate ability to perform better in sports. So when they were told that, guess how many balls they put it into the hole? The white males putted less balls into the hole. They were all athletes. They all had really good ability at hand-eye coordination. But it was simply how these things were phrased that gave particular groups maybe what you would call an advantage, so to speak, and you saw the performance improve.
It seems we're talking about explicit stereotype threat, being told that there are group differences. What about more subtle behavioral, like over-talking or dismissive body language, these sorts of cues that you don't matter, and that nothing is expected of you of importance? Is this something that's also addressed in the studies, or is it explicit?
Yes, and I can show it to you.
Okay.
I'll show it to you momentarily.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah. So, okay, so I'll get there right now, right? So again, the underperformance effect is when we look at how threat is affecting people's performance compared to the no threat condition. And what I'll show is the performance improvement when we look at those threat reducing strategies, okay? So we had a very large sample of 316 studies, over 26,000 participants. And K, so when you see this throughout my slides, K stands for the number of studies in any given analysis. We only did analysis with groups that had 4 or more, because that was the best way to estimate a semi-accurate effect size. We like to be much larger than that, at least 10 studies or more. So 4 is the largest group. Okay? So we've estimated the overall effect size for a number of demographic variables of interest. These are the largest groups in the setting, in the literature. The elderly, gender, this can include men and women, various racial and ethnic groups, members of low socioeconomic status, and a group of other, a little collection of studies that I can talk about a little later if you're interested. There were samples from the US. About 65% of the studies have been conducted in the US, 35% abroad, mostly in Western Europe and Australia. We look at different age cohorts from primary to non-college populations, and also institution type as well, from elite institutions to top 100s, non-elite, HBCUs, things like that. And we also look at a bunch of moderators. I won't spend time on this today, but we do know in the literature that how strongly one's identified with math or academics can affect people's performance on the test. Okay. So to orient you with the graph, on the y-axis is our effect size. 0.2 is a small effect size in the literature. 0.5 is considered moderate, and 0.8 higher is considered large. These are based on Cohen's conventions. And what we find for stereotype threat is negative 0.469 across these 316 studies. Now, it's considered a moderate effect size. However, it's very large for social science. One prominent meta-analysis you may have heard about was with video games and aggression. And it was a very important and significant meta-analysis. The effect sizes all hovered around 0.2. Okay? And this information was very important and affected policy and how people think about gaming among violent games with children. So this is pretty significant that we have this size of an effect. Okay? So now I want to just quickly break it down so you can see some of the different groups and their effect sizes. Among the elderly, different ethnic or racial groups. And we broke this down into different groups: African Americans, non-US minorities, Latinos or Hispanics, and whites. Okay? And you can see, and people often ask, why is it so strong? Why is it stronger, say for whites compared to other groups? And we've been thinking a lot about that, and some of it may have to do with the fact that some groups have had less experience with dealing with stereotype threat than others. So actually experiencing it could be a larger blow sometimes. Okay. Members of low socioeconomic status, women, and this is usually in math disciplines, STEM disciplines, and others. Okay, so there's a little collection of studies that are non-traditionally stereotyped studies, and you can see that it's a large effect size as well, likely due to the fact that they're not as often implicated in stereotype threat sort of situations. Okay? The take-home point for this is that these effect sizes are all significant. They all are significantly different than 0, and they're all relatively similar, except for if we look at comparing African Americans to women, Hispanics, and whites. African Americans is actually the smaller effect size. So I'll come back and talk to you about why we think that may be the case. Yes?
Did you do any study, or is it possible even to do any study to see what might happen to the effect of stereotype threat if you belong to more than one of those groups, like Black women? With the
Yes, so there have not been many studies that actually do that. And it's sort of hard to tease it apart because a lot of the data we collect, we go through the articles and pull out the statistics that they posted, in the papers. And when it's really hard, we contact the authors themselves. So there have not been much stereotype threat research on this intersectionality issue that you're bringing up. But that's a really good point. It's something we think to look at. We should look at in the future. But there is some work by a researcher, I think his name is Jim Sodanis, and he does some research on that topic of double jeopardy, so to speak. Do Black women have it harder, or why or why not? And so there's been some research on that, okay? So here are some of the findings. So again, K are the number of studies in each set, and the G is the effect size. So what we see, and this kind of mirrors that first thought that the early stereotype threat researchers had, that this effect probably is strongest among the most identified, those students that care the most. And they kind of thought that that could occur at elite institutions, and we actually see that the effect size is much stronger at some of these elite institutions compared to others. And that issue with the lower effect size for Black students, we have a lot of Black students that fall into some of these camps as well. And it could be some reason that it's depressing the effect size overall. So I still need to pull that apart, but that's potentially an issue there. So here's just the pattern results for students across different age cohorts. And overall, the trend is that over time it gets worse, okay? There are fewer studies in this group here, but people have actually written that these 2 points, middle school and undergrad, college, are the points where some of these stereotypes are strongly reinforced. So a lot of students first see stereotype threat here, especially women, girls in math and science, and then again it's reinforced here in college, where we see a lot of the attrition among women in some of the STEM fields. There were significant differences between elementary school kids compared to undergraduates and high school kids compared to undergraduates. So now, to address your issue about the subtle nature, we looked at a variety of threat-inducing cues, okay? So what is causing stereotype threat? There are a number of things. We can make group differences salient. So some studies hit people over the head with it. They're salient. When people are in a situation where they are solo in a particular setting, that could cause it, for example. When people are reminded of their racial or gender group, for example, so when they have to answer demographic questions on an exam or something, that has been shown to cause it. And actually, some of the good news is, after we've done a lot of this work, ETS, when that change, they had a new change of a president of ETS, they've now taken that out for the remainder of the SAT. So they're keeping data to see if this will actually change things. Interpersonal threat are some studies where people find themselves interacting with a person that may seem sexist or racist, and that's sort of a subtle thing. So it could be some of these microaggressions that you're speaking of. There's other things that people do, multiple cues that people put together. And interestingly, there's a group of studies, about 83 of them, where people do absolutely nothing. They just tell people to take a test. And it's just as strong as any other threatening cue. So this is what we think is the threat in the air. You don't have to purposefully try to trigger stereotype threat for it to occur. Okay? So the last main thing I wanted to talk about were these strategies to improve performance. Okay? And this is a little different now. The 0 is on the bottom of the graph, and we're going to do positive effect sizes to show the performance improvement, just for ease of interpretation. Okay? So importantly, there were many studies that did nothing to reduce stereotype threat compared to some studies that used a particular strategy. Now, when I say they do nothing, what I mean is they don't actively attempt to remove stereotype threat in the no threat condition, but in the threat condition, they may do something extra, like say, there are group differences expected on this task, something like that. So the point we want to make here is that it's important to remove stereotype threat. Okay? We see that the effect of people's performance significantly improves when you actively try to reduce it. So I'll talk about what some of these strategies are as I wrap up. So one we talked about is describing a task as non-evaluative. Another is mentioning that there are no group differences expected on this task. Again, 2 sort of heavy-handed versions, right? There are a series of intra-psychic strategies, is what we've termed it. And these are various things that people can do psychologically to reduce threat, ways to manage the threat that they may feel, for example. Situational strategies are changing the features of the organization of a setting to reduce threat. So I'll give you a few examples of what some of these intrapsychic strategies are. And we coded all of these studies along all these dimensions systematically to find, as recorded throughout the literature. Okay? So when making one's group identity salient is a particular strategy. And what that means is we can highlight commonalities among groups rather than indicating one particular group independently. Priming positive qualities in groups. So the example of the study with the Asian women, when you highlight a particular identity like that, it could improve performance, for example. Or highlighting a superordinate identity. So talking about college students broadly, or the Davidson, right, the group, something like that. Those sorts of things could help it. Individuation techniques. So these are reminding people of important values that are outside of particular academic values. So it could be a person's religious value, or other things that people can kind of hold on to sustain them through challenging tasks or courses. And managing negative thoughts and emotions. So there's a lot of tasks. People help students to reappraise their negative feelings that they may have in particular classes, on exams, things like that. Some situational strategies are forming positive relationships with non-stereotyped group members, or imagining these relationships, for example, so sort of getting out of our comfort zones. When we're in diverse settings, so we call it non-solo status, we see that performance improves, and having role models, both role models that match us in identity and that disconfirm negative stereotypes. So this doesn't have to necessarily be a role model that matches us, but there's a role model that actively works against these negative stereotypes, that they don't show these sort of maybe microaggressions or various things in a setting. Okay? So you can see these are quite diverse. So there are quite a lot of strategies that have been used. And here are the effect sizes for all of them. Okay, the ones that work the best are the intrapsychic and situational strategies, which are the ones that are not very heavy-handed at all. People ask, why is this one so low? I mean, it's still significant, so it works, but why is it lower than some of the others? And we think it's because it could kind of be hard to pull off, right? To say, this task is, we don't expect any differences on y'all. Why are you telling me that in the first place? So we see that these sort of strategies are the ones that really work to ameliorate these negative effects. Okay? So I just want to bring it home to remind everybody that we see stereotype threat as something that's in the air, that everyone can experience it, and we try to show that across a number of groups. It seems to get stronger over time if we don't deal with it, and it's present in both learning and performance environments. Okay. There are many strategies to reduce stereotype threat, but you must actively do something. You just can't leave the setting as it is. And finally, people are very receptive to interventions, and I shared a lot of them, and we can talk one-on-one if people are interested in any in particular. And so it's just important to remember that we must actually use these interventions to improve people's outcomes across these settings. So with that, I will just thank you all for your time.
I understand some people may need to leave, but Dr. Taylor will take some notes. Thank you.
Yes.
You mentioned the term microaggressions. Can you elaborate a little bit?
So oftentimes people see microaggressions as the small little behaviors that occur between people that suggest that you devalue them. So it could be a side glance, or ignoring someone's hand when they repeatedly have it up, or maybe not calling on them. So it's small little things that people begin to interpret as being rude and potentially being related to the group that they belong to.
Is that related to the in the air kind of phenomenon? Because those seem so subtle.
Yeah,
but they kind of
it's related.
Cumulative in nature over time with it.
Yeah, so that's the idea as well. Yes.
I'm so glad you responded to me because I'm the oldest white guy. Related to what Hilton was talking about, I study physiological arousal some, and the idea about the Yerkes-Dodson law,
Yes.
about how there is an optimal level of arousal for performance. If you don't have any, you don't perform well. If you have much too much, you don't perform well. Is part of the intrapsychic strategy to help people label that arousal in a constructive way? I'm thinking about what Hilton said.
I hadn't actually thought of it in those terms, but I actually think that's a really good analogy, because a lot of times people feel that frustration and anxiety and don't know what to do with it. And so when they can reinterpret a situation, they can reframe a situation is one of the techniques that they have students do, for example. It does help them kind of maintain an optimal level of performance arousal, I guess. So yeah, I think that is a really nice way of thinking about the process. Yeah.
So something that I think is really troubling looking at your results as a whole is that it looks like across groups that the way we respond to stereotype threat is a behavior that can be interpreted as reinforcing the stereotype. And so I'm wondering, this is an extension of your results, but I'm wondering if other people or if you have worked on that as well to see if there is this unfortunate positive feedback between the reaction to stereotype threat and then the person who may be perceiving or maybe engaging in the stereotype in the first place. It just reinforces how they feel.
So you mean sort of the self-fulfilling prophecy
Yes.
sort of thing?
Yeah.
Yeah, people have sort of written about it in those sort of ways a little bit. And unfortunately, sometimes perhaps that could be the case. So we really think it's really important to educate people on stereotype threat. One really good remedy is actually teaching students about stereotype threat. When you teach women, there's a really nice study that when you teach women about it, you see the effects go away. Because again, it's being able to label and kind of reframe what this is. And when that begins to happen over time, you know, other people can start to see that this is not an effect about an unintelligent group of people. But it is this issue that takes some time. So in the meantime, we're working with trying to kind of get this idea out and kind of stop the pernicious effects that which can be kind of self-fulfilling in a way.
Can you just give us some specific examples of what we might say when we're introducing a test or assignment? Because I'm an English teacher, so I can't say studies have shown that this test has no bias, because there are no studies, right? But what kinds of things can we say here at Davidson before we introduce some kind of activity to reduce?
So I don't think it's really easy or effective to do the more heavy-handed things anyway. I think it's the environment that you create from the first day of class. So it's ensuring that a lot of times we would like to ensure, with a little help from us as the professors, that some of the groups are diverse in particular ways. Don't always allow students to self-select some of the ways that they put themselves into groups. And sometimes you can't create, say, ethnic diversity or gender diversity, but you can create diversity of ideas and various things. You do a survey at the beginning of my classes where I always try to figure out what students want to do with their lives, and then I can sort of try to pair them up a little bit differently and switch that up throughout the semester as well. Some of the messages that you give from the beginning. So ensuring that you have an inclusive classroom. I teach statistics mainly, and people always ask, how can we integrate this sort of thing in a math class, So what I try to do is include various examples of tests, psychological studies, or surveys that they can do as a class to get the mean, median, mode, standard deviation, t-test, all these sorts of things. But there are surveys that may ask about people's sort of their opinions on, say, same-sex marriage, for example, or how prejudice or racial things have changed over time. So I'm not talking about that issue, but I'm using it to teach a particular concept that doesn't have anything necessarily to do with some of these ideas. So just making sure that the classroom includes these topics, I think is really important. Students may begin to feel safe. When I teach some of my other classes, content courses, social psychology, for example, I just do the beginning. We are going to have a safe classroom here. People are going to have differences of opinions. We're going to have to learn how to respect them. I just do the first day sort of thing and kind of see where it falls out from there. But I think it's a practice. It's a mindset that we as educators must adopt. And if we can at all bring in examples of role models, because role models don't have to be physical. They can be things we read about, or they can be us ourselves, kind of modeling the behavior to show students that they should feel comfortable and they can get help here. Another one is disarming them so they can come talk to us. Because that's another problem. Sometimes they are really nervous to raise their hand or to reach out to us. I would never single out a student, but I would, walk around the classroom kind of like what you're telling me, introduce myself to everyone. And being at a small school, that works. When I was an undergrad at University of Texas at Austin, my first psychology class, was the first semester, it was 500 people in the class. I will never forget because there were about 4 black people, and I was trying to be a good student, so I guess I sat in the second row, and I missed class one day, and the next class the professor said, "I noticed you weren't here." You know, that was a little tough, you know, because I realized that I stood out, you know, for certain reasons. But he didn't necessarily make it clear to me that he wanted to care. You know, it was just like, bad girl, you weren't here, you know? So it was sort of a struggle for me initially. So, you know, reflecting back on that experience, you know, I think about how could he have transformed that into something really positive for me as a student there. So that was a lot, but hopefully that was something, you know, yes.
In your own teaching or your own classroom, have you found particular ways of inviting the students to either express their own individual identities or to create sites of group identity that are not vulnerable to stereotype threat? Right.
Oh.
So in other words, like, I don't know what those would be, but as a way of sort of I get the individuation, so this is about personalized learning. Everybody learns differently. We're going to try to understand. I, as your professor, need to understand how this particular group of 30 people learn, because then we can have a more effective class. But are there sites of group identity that you can sort of lay out there for the students to kind of create for themselves, so that aren't subject then later to this sort of stereotype stuff?
So sometimes people do it in teams. It works really well in sports, actually. Like, sports is this beautiful example where people can kind of overcome some of this sometimes. So if you can create some sort of team activities, in psychology they do a lot of this jigsaw puzzle thing where different people are required to provide information to complete this project. So you must rely on others who are different from you, and therefore you see the value that other people can provide something valuable to you. Also, we'll have people, when I know we're going to talk about something that's uncomfortable, we first like to have people express what they're feeling to themselves and then reflect back on it later. So you might feel uncomfortable, but write down why you think you're feeling uncomfortable. What identity is it that is making you feel uncomfortable? And when people can reflect upon that, they can start to empathize with many other groups that they never even considered may feel that same way. So I think reflection is just a really big piece of helping people understand other perspectives as well.
One more question.
Speaking from my experience as a role model, it's something also, I think what you presenting here makes perfect and intuitive sense. But it seems to be things that you actually embody as a person, more than things you like announce to the group. Maybe you announce things to the group you highlight, stereotype threat. I think it's more what you embody as a person, also showing that your difference is normal and average. And also it's emphasizing the thing that, even though it's Black history. It's Black history. It's Black history everybody's everywhere else, and it compares very much to the histories of others. And also, don't just, somehow they're experts on us and we're not experts on them. Emphasize, I'm not from white history. I teach white history all the time and make a point of it, that this belongs to you too, and that you can claim all of this as yours. Don't get trapped in the role of being different and being the victim. Take command and take control. Think don't do saying. You can also stand up, and Rosa Parks stood up, you can too, in the classroom. So, don't be ready to have courage as well. And don't just give too much. It's like you're supposed to be this trapped victim and sorry for yourself.
Yeah. So it's a really good point. The issue is a lot of students don't feel that way.
Yeah.
It's not that they feel inferior.
Yeah.
And that's sort of a big point that some of the original research wanted to make, that these students were highly selected students at some of these institutions and they were still falling prey to some of these processes. So what was causing it? Was it that they had an inferiority complex? Was it that they really saw themselves as, that they didn't try hard enough? And it was sort of what, the guy was talking about the arousal curve, that a lot of times it's these physiological things that sort of can interrupt some of the processes that
Like flight or fright, is that sort of like?
sort of something like
Yeah.
that. So it's really important to not only learn for people how to manage that,
Yeah.
but also how to create things, how we can from the outside create things to
Yeah.
improve that. So I think it's from both sides of the spectrum. So I don't want to blame the victim at all, and also I don't want to totally divorce some of the strategies that people can use to manage this feeling as well from the process. So, do you want to say?
What?
President Cole.
Oh, what?
Oh, no. I differ.
I thought you were pointing to me. I had one thought of one very specific announcement I might make that might make a difference. Let me know if it's a good idea. Is just saying that office hours are non-evaluative. I mean, this is a common thing here, but a lot of people feel like, okay, I'm coming to your office hour for help. That's going to somehow make you think I'm not a strong student or something. I want to see and help understand how they're learning.
I think that's a great idea, and I didn't think of it, but I force students. I have a role, and I say on the first day of class, everybody sign up, 10-minute session in pairs, and you come up to see me. I mean, it is a little intensive for the first 2 weeks of school, and I'm tired, but I've met all 60 of my students in stats, and I still deal with a little anxiety, even though I teach all women, around math. And it helps disarm miraculously. So you can see how that could work wonders across different fields and classes. I like that idea.
All right, one more. You've been trying to ask a question.
No, I was thinking, in a lot of your presentation, a lot of the questions are focused on accepting, I mean, I see the data is very, very good, you see this, and here's how we're going to deal with it. But I mean, do you ever think, like, perhaps we just, have a society where this is not the case? Is that entirely unrealistic? In cross-cultural studies, do you see that in some societies being different doesn't mean you have to be scared? It doesn't mean you have to have expectations. Is it a function of American society? Does it have to do with certain factors? Does it have to do with the composition of having a majority and minorities? If you have a very equally partitioned society, I was wondering.
It is not just a feature of American society at all. So if you go to any society where there's one group that's considered kind of worse than another group, you can see that the Maoris in Australia, for example, there's a group in Japan, there's a sect in Japan. You see that they have one standard deviation lower on all IQ tests. So it's everywhere in the world for whatever reason. I don't know if it's like just a feature of humans that we must always separate and divide and conquer, But so it's hard for me to kind of really answer that question. I think it's sort of an anthropological question in a certain way. But I do think that what our data suggests is very clearly that we have to address it. There is no point in ignoring it. Right? So people think it's safe if we don't mention any of these things. But it's really important to address people's diversity and not see it as a liability. See it as we're all bringing something to the table and understand it positively instead of as, if I bring it up, it must mean that we're racist or something, or we're sexist. I think it actually brings more people into the fold because they realize you're willing to care that I'm different. And I mean, I'm always, not different in the sense of weird, but that I bring different things to the table, different. And if you mention that, it matters to me. I care about that. So we don't want people to be afraid to mention differences.
Well,
So thank you.
Thank you.